So how it will work is obviously the first speaker will be from the proposition, then there'll be a second speaker from the opposition, both have 5 minutes each. We will not be doing points of information today, so there will be no, the entire 5 minutes will be uninterrupted. And then we'll have questions for those two speakers. Then afterwards, we'll have the second proposition and the second opposition, and then we'll have questions for them after their speeches. And we'll have a final vote, and that will be the end of proceedings. We do not have a guest speaker today, so it should be a little bit shorter than last sort of week or so debate. Right, so we'll go to the vote. If you can all sort of react with a thumbs up to the question. So those in favour of the motion that this House believes cancel culture has gone too far, please do a thumbs up now. Okay. And can everyone who disagrees with the motion, please, so those who do not believe that cancel culture has gone too far, raise their thumbs up now. And those who are abstaining. No one abstaining. Brilliant. Okay. Right. Okay, I see there's another one on the side. Okay, well, I now call upon the first speaker for this debate, and that is Gabe for the proposition. Gabe.
Thank you. In 2020, there's one C word more politically charged than coronavirus: cancelled. Now, in my speech today, I'll be looking at how cancel culture's evolution undermines its original purpose and has actually become harmful in what it set out to do. And second of all, I will be looking at how it restricts discourse and divides our society even further than it already is. But first, a definition. What do we mean when we say cancel culture? We mean the public withdrawal of support and denouncing certain people, brands, or movements after doing something that is considered offensive or inappropriate, which is essentially a form of group shaming that deprives them of business time or attention. Now, a brief looking at cancel culture. We believe that cancel culture started out with good intentions, such as the Me Too movement being a strong example of bringing people to justice when it came to alleged abusers and predators. This empowerment came from the collective action that's hard to replicate on an individual scale. And we believe that because cancel culture's original content in generating change, in improving equality representation, that it is appropriate that given it is targeted towards large institutions or individuals such as Harvey Weinstein that need to be held accountable with their reputation dragged through the mud. Now on to my first point about how cancel culture evolution undermines its original purpose. The original constructive benefits of calling people out has become a weaponized phrase thrown about. In present, cancel culture and headlines are about things of a much smaller scale and less importance compared to the monumental movement of the last. Obama took issue with the current stage of cancel culture, saying that the belief that one can bring about change by being super judgmental and through Twitter hashtags is destructive and is not activism or actually bringing about change. In addition, the false accusations, or more importantly, taking statements out of context, can spiral out of control with the atmosphere that cancel culture creates, especially in our online society with likes, reshares, and comments magnifying situations out of proportion. This leads to a very messy and disorganized group hunt going after someone who people may not have even heard of before, and makes everyone outraged online and leads to information being pulled from questionable sources and overall disconnects people from the situation that they were originally in. We see this rush judgment in very complicated and nuanced situations as very dangerous, and instead should be anagalized to the law, which we see to be founded on the principle that someone is innocent until proven guilty, and the importance of recognition of hearing all sides of the debate rather than the kangaroo court of Twitter that cancel culture has created today. On the one end of the spectrum are people like Bill Cosby, Harvey Weinstein, and R. Kelly, who are cancelled by the public before their sex crime trials, which we completely agree with. On the other hand, there are celebrities like Jodie Comer, who was cancelled for being pictured with a man who may or may not have been Republican. We believe that in the latter case, it is when cancel culture has gone way too far. An alternative for this is call-out culture, which is related but distinct, as it is the preceding stage to cancel culture, where people are given the chance to own up to their mistakes and inform them of what they've done, which is wrong, rather than the binary nature of cancel culture, which doesn't let them or others learn from what they've done wrong. Now, on to my second point about how it restricts the discourse and divides our society. Cancel culture creates an atmosphere of a loss of open debate and tolerance and shuts down discussions and is very divisive. And this is not helpful at all to advance points, with people on either sides screaming based on their side of the political spectrum. Instead, we should be advocating for people's voices to be heard openly and fairly and candidly, rather than creating these echo chambers that we have made of the same point being repeated and again, which does not engage or come to any solutions of the deeper issues at stake. For example, with Jennifer Lawrence, who opened up that she was a Republican before President Trump, people came for her in a very hostile manner, which we believe cancel culture has contributed to enormously. So rather than these people engaging, asking her why and such, she was shamed for having these views that were different. The lack of communication between both sides polarizes opinions to the extreme, with Trump and populism being a symptom, we think, of this division and ignorance of the opposite view. And this whole excluding leads to leaders who want to remove cancel culture and pushes people out to both sides, to the extremity of both sides. We need call-out culture to engage in productive debate. For these reasons, we need to cancel the toxic and harmful concept that cancel culture has become. Thank you.
Thank you for that, Gabe. And we now turn to the first opposition, Dan.
Thank you. So, has cancel culture gone too far? And I have to say, it's quite an easy statement to agree with at first time hearing it, because it sounds a bit scary, doesn't it? To be cancelled, to be silenced, excluded from public discourse by some politically correct mob simply for expressing your free opinion. And besides, we've seen very tragic stories over the past years of people like historian David Starkey, who felt forced to resign his Fitzwilliam College honorary fellowship for referring to the Black British population as, quote, so many damn blacks, unquote, or everyone's favorite Harry Potter author, J.K. Rowling, who received enormous amounts of negative reactions for making statements about transgenders that were seen as hurtful by many. But yet, even though it may feel like such an intuitively scary thing, cancel culture, I want to argue tonight, and I hope you will join me in agreeing that cancel culture has not gone too far, for the simple reason that it simply doesn't exist in the way it's pretended to be a thing by the opposite side. So first of all, cancel culture would lead to people being silenced and being excluded for their positions. Well, that, put very simply and factually, is not the case. So most of those people who have been cancelled still write, they still publish, they still appear on TV, and they still have platforms that most of us here will never have access to in our whole lives. Even stronger, the only reason why we know about those people being silenced is because they're so loud. We can hear them all the time. So people really are not being silenced. That is simply not the case. But then about freedom of expression and shutting down discussion, I actually believe that the opposite of that is happening. So there have always been people with access to traditional media who could show their view of the world, and people never really went against that. When you were in a room with famous historian David Starkey, and he'd said something you thought was particularly nasty or hurtful to many people, you'd probably just be silent because it'd be a bit awkward and he's such a famous name and you're just a nobody. Well, now with the rise of social media, we've given the opportunity to potentially everyone to start engaging in discussions and to open up new debates, and that has led to some of the more conventional positions and people holding conventional positions to be challenged in the ways that haven't been challenged before. And yes, that's scary, but it's important to know that they can still exercise their right to free expression as much as they want, because it's important to realize that the right to free expression is not the right to TV interviews, the right to speak at the Cambridge Union Society. All those things are not symptoms of free expression. They are they show a privileged position within society that is given to people because people like them or because they think they've done good things, but they're not rights. And when society shifts, or when more people start to engage in discussions that have been silent before, those things can change, and people that have previously have held very prominent positions may be told, well, maybe we don't like you as much as they thought before, maybe we think your ideas are stupid, and maybe we think you should talk just a bit less. And if anything, I believe that that's an increase in freedom of expression and a diversifying of open and free debate by simply opening up the debate to more people instead of allowing the same people to spread their unchallenged opinions time and time again. So I have argued here tonight, and I hope you would agree with me, that not only has cancel culture not gone too far, cancel culture isn't really a thing simply because no one is being cancelled. People are being challenged, and sometimes things go wrong. Sometimes people say hurtful things, but that are just symptoms of our mass media and social media system, not a core principle and element of something called cancel culture. It does not exist, and that's what I hope you will support our side tonight. Thank you.
Thank you for that, Dan. And we now move to questions for the first two speakers. Well, I've actually got a question already. So unless the speakers have any urgent points of information or questions, I will go. Oh, yes, Excel.
I would just like to ask the first proposition, what date or roughly what timeline he thinks cancel culture began. It's not a challenge, just a question.
I would say that cancel culture really began to take off traction with the Me Too movement, although, of course, you could find examples before this.
When you say before this, just roughly what time?
Sorry,
I would.
Can you two? Sorry, there's no reply after the questions. Okay, thank you. Sorry, couldn't unmute myself quick enough. Right, so I have a question from a audience member, and this is to the opposition. They ask, what do the opposition have to say about bad faith political actors? About cancel? What do they have to say about bad faith political actors? To say about cancel culture being co-opted for a tactical advantage? If you got what that meant in English.
Yeah, so they're referring to people sort of using other people's outrage to silence some political opponents. I think that's what they meant. I don't know, that it doesn't sound like a very pleasant thing, but at the same time, it sounds a bit like people, like politicians, just gaining advantage from their opponents doing something stupid. And it's still the freedom of the people who are engaged in what you call the cancelling of a politician to do what they want. It's still their expression of their opinions on a certain public figure. So I don't think politicians are really behind that to try and demonize or undermine their opponents. Yes, they might have some benefits from it, but you can get benefits from all kinds of different sources, and I don't think that's very, very relevant here.
Thanks for that, Dan. I have no more questions as such from audience. Does anyone else amongst the speakers have a question before we turn to the next set of speakers? No. Okay, we will now move to the next proposition, the second proposition speaker, which is Natasha.
When individuals are being slammed online and suddenly banished from the public eye, when social media creates echo chambers that continue circulating the same views that lacks discourse, and when judgment is enough justification for spewing even more hate, we see a problem. In the era of online opinions, polls, and hashtags, instead of generating real waves of change, people are taking sides on debates where there is no purpose except generating noise. Who gets to determine what is correct and incorrect? This is not an activism, but crucifying individuals for expressing a view that is different to your own. The movement of cancel culture has become a cesspool of toxicity, where individuals are not given a second chance to learn from their mistakes. The moment you make a mistake, you lose your currency. Your voice is silenced and you're done. Tonight, 2 issues. Firstly, how cancel culture reduces airtime for far more important issues. And secondly, the danger to the people who are targeted. On both sides, we want real change with a greater awareness of mistakes that deserve to be called out and rectified. But what cancel culture is nowadays is not the way. Tonight from the opposition, we heard mainly that cancel culture doesn't actually exist, that no one is being cancelled. However, we believe that this is a rather incorrect mischaracterization about what this debate is about, with his examples focusing on racists in academia. Instead, we think that the moment you turn to Google or entertainment news or cultural news, cancelled is a very common word used when celebrities often or brands have done something wrong. So we think that instead, cancel culture does very much exist in many areas of our culture, and focusing on academia is just too much of a narrow look. Secondly, we heard that social media and this movement of cancel culture has allowed greater discussions and opening up free debates for people to share their views, which wasn't the case in traditional media. We agree that discussion is very important, which we heard from first. However, the opposition has based this argument on 2 premises. Firstly, that people like Starkley were not challenged before, and secondly, that social media discourse is nuanced enough to have this open debate. We believe that in social media, when you've got these issues magnified to millions of people worldwide, we don't think that any nuances in discussion actually happens. Instead, we see two general sides with people randomly jumping onto them and getting very emotional over issues that aren't even connected to them. And so for this reason, we believe that not only is cancel culture definitely something that exists, but it has become much worse in the modern era because of social media. So now onto my substantive. Firstly, how it reduces airtime of important issues. We think that currently a lot of the cancel culture is centered around issues about celebrities and gossip, and we think that this has led to an oversaturation of celebrities being called out. We think there's a lot of focus on petty dramas like James Charles and Tati Westbrook, or Taylor Swift and Kanye West. And we think that in this era of personal drama being posted online with videos and apology videos and a lot of money being generated to these people, it has meant that a lot of very important issues are being left out of discussion. Even more recently, for example, Doja Cat was being cancelled for being rude to fans on Twitter who called her out after she went to a huge Halloween party. So while we think that it was important in this case for people to publicly call out her actions, which we see is very beneficial in call out culture, but not cancel culture, it seems that overall, society's general attention is based on celebrities and smaller issues. In a couple of months' time, this will be forgotten. Will people unfollow Doja Cat? Maybe. Will people burn her albums? Maybe. But she'll continue selling music and continually gaining money from something that she hasn't learned from. We think there are far more important issues in society like insensitivity, prejudice, racism, misogyny that is not being addressed because of this oversaturation of gossip. So secondly, we think that overall cancel culture has led to a lot of danger for the people targeted themselves. We think that the typical person engaging in cancel culture is not like an academic person who wants to challenge David Starkley. We think instead it is your average Twitter user or a hardcore fan who gets angry and passionate and swept up by internet drama. So we think that when people are liking things, are sharing things, are adding fuel to the fire with people jumping on both sides without proper investigation, this leads to a lot of dangerous activities like doxing, where private information is shared online. Kim K, Jay-Z, Scarlett Johansson. The list goes on because of fans becoming so angry over mistakes that they have done that they go out of their way to actively hurt them. No matter the severity of the mistakes, we think that these people always deserve a second chance to at least own up to their mistakes and learn from them. So, to conclude, because cancel culture only shifts the blame and obscures larger issues, we are very proud to oppose and believe that in improving society for the better, cancel culture has definitely gone too far. Thank you.
Thank you, Natasha. And we now move to our final speaker for the opposition, Excel.
Hi. I will be making the argument that cancel culture, split into two parts, ostracism and criticism, has not gone too far. And a lot of the issues addressed by the proposition are neither endemic to cancel culture nor amoral. But firstly, I would like to address some points made by the proposition. I'd like to highlight in their argument about Doja Cat and the effectiveness of cancel culture, they have contradicted themselves. The idea that once someone is cancelled, it'll be moved on from in about 2 to 3 months contradicts the idea that it's effective and life ruinous for massive celebrities with a lot of power. I would also like to highlight that the examples given of Jodie Comer and Jennifer Lawrence are also contradictory. In the same month as Jodie Comer receiving criticism for being around someone who might be right-wing, she hit the Heat's rich list for the first time in her life for £100,000 per episode of Killing Eve. Jennifer Lawrence simultaneously, while referencing the issue of voting for John McCain, also highlighted that the worst moments of her life were in 2014 when she was harassed, not by cancel culture, but by sexists online who leaked her private pictures. Moving on. Cancel culture is split into two parts. Ostracism, which is choosing not to patronize someone or support them financially, and criticism, which is using someone as a point of reference for inappropriate behavior. The ostracism highlighted by the proposition is not endemic or amoral to cancel culture. This is in terms of people losing financial support, being fired from their jobs, or being removed from social media. If people don't want to see your comedy show, if customers don't want to buy your stuff, if a website doesn't want to show your videos, those are private entities exercising their rights in the free market. If you disagree with cancel culture in the sense of not getting the job you wanted, or not having a Netflix show, or not being on TV anymore, you disagree with capitalism. Secondly, the idea that cancel culture and moral outrage are enmeshed is also incorrect. Gabe, the first proposition, highlighted that he believes cancel culture began in 2014, roughly, during the Me Too movement. But we have examples like Marilyn Monroe losing financial support for supporting Black jazz singer Ella Fitzgerald. We have Lisa Bonet getting fired from The Crosby Show after her adult role in A Different World. We have the Monty Pythons and The Life of Brian. It was widely protested. People went to the streets and 39 local authorities banned the movie from being shown. Is this cancel culture, or is it just moral outrage? Half the time when we discuss behaviors like doxing, harassment, stalking, false allegation, ridicule, online hoaxes, media outrage, partisanism, and lack of nuance, we're discussing problems endemic to our society, unrelated to whether or not you can type about it on Twitter. The creation of a toxic online culture and cyberbullying and depression of victims would exist with or without someone being mean to Jennifer Lawrence on Twitter. These problems are not with cancel culture. Online harassment and cyberbullying has existed as long as message boards have existed in the 90s. This is not cancel culture. This is a reaction. If we would call people not liking your stuff criticism, why would we call someone reacting to you on Twitter cancel culture? It seems to me that the whole narrative of cancel culture has been created by the powerful in response to a backlash they're finally viewing for the first time because of social media. In the past, as Dan highlighted, if you had a problem with racist, sexist, homophobic, transphobic behavior, You weren't empowered to have a voice to talk about it. And now for the first time, people can express their opinions about this. If a private company chooses not to associate with you, or if large groups of people no longer want to fund you, that's not our fault, that's yours. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Excel, and thank you everyone, every single speaker for your speeches tonight. We now come to questions, and I have several already from audience members to me privately. Audience, feel free to post your messages on the chat, or you can send them to me privately, but send them to George rather than the Fitzwilliam College person. Okay, so the first question I have, and this is for the first opposition member. The question is, August Ames killed herself after being cancelled. So how does this not have an impact?
Well, I think situations like this is, as my colleague Excel described, there are problems like cyberbullying that have existed for a long time and that can overlap with people criticizing other people's behavior, but they're not a direct part of it. Of course, we're not saying that shouting at someone to go kill themselves is expressing an opinion. Expressing an opinion is saying you're doing something wrong, we don't agree with it. And sometimes that overlaps, but that happens in a lot of cases, and that is very tragic. But I do not believe that as a direct consequence or the fault of more people choosing to speak out for what they believe is right and wrong.
Thank you for that, Dan. And a question to all the panelists from an audience member. What are your thoughts on students attempting to have a Claire Porter dismissed from his job after his resignation as a counsellor after refusing to agree that trans women are women, trans men are men, non-binary people are non-binary? Is this an example of cancel culture going too far in students who don't work attempting to end someone's livelihood? Or is this within the acceptable limits of cancel culture? Who wants to go with that first? If you put your hand up. Which panelist wants to go first? Excel?
I think when we define cases like these as cancel culture, we're contributing to a narrative that's harmful to marginalized people. If someone who is transphobic shouldn't have to teach transgender people. I think I would say the same thing about someone who's racist. I wouldn't want to be taught by a racist professor, and I wouldn't want to work with a racist person. And if someone is outwardly racist, I wouldn't want to be associated with them. It does harm and disservice, and also silences marginalized people if you put someone who marginalizes them in a position of power. I think that's the problem with the cancel culture discourse, is that it turns the criticism of marginalized people into some kind of toxic, magnanimous idea of bad thing that groups do. This isn't cancel culture. It's just transgender people not wanting to be taught or have or be directed by a transphobe.
Does any of the other panelists want to answer that, the question? If you raise your hand and then I'll mention you. Gabe or Dan? Yeah, Gabe.
Yeah, so for this case specifically, I think with trans rights, with such a controversial issue for many different people of many religions, to just fire the porter immediately without any discussion at all would most likely fit into the cancel culture narrative that these groups of students would push ahead for the action for him to lose his job in this case. However, I think that if we look at this from a call-out culture perspective, it would be much more productive to engage in discussion with the porter to see exactly, okay, why are people thinking these types of views? And then engage in a form of debate to see exactly what he meant with those statements, that the context of them is it is so much more than just taking this one statement and putting it on its own. And then perhaps if there was obviously some harmful intent behind this, some harmful, hateful attempt that was meant to cause distress to others, then yes, it could be a perfectly acceptable conclusion to fire him for this, to make the other students feel safe. But to do this with no other debate, without letting others know, that would fall into cancel culture for me.
Dan, do you want to come to that question or not?
I think just a bit of reaction to what Gabe mentioned. Of course, it always sounds good to just go in discussion and everything will be solved. And in many cases that is true, but I do believe that there are points when you will have to draw a line, because there are things that people have had discussions about for decades, for generations. And at a certain point, I do believe that we can say, well, maybe this is not acceptable anymore. But then again, the most important thing is, it is about students who are expressing their view on what is acceptable or not, and they're calling on the college to take action. So they are engaging already, I would say, in that debate, in taking the position I just described, of saying we've had enough discussion, we need to draw some lines. So I believe that this is, again, you could call it cancel culture, but it's really just people expressing how they view the world, and stating how they look on the matter.
And Natasha, did you want an opportunity to answer the first question? Did you manage to hear it?
I only heard half of it, but I think there is a fine line between cancelling someone because you don't agree with them and cancelling someone because of quite harmful things they have said. And I think it is very difficult to judge in what cases is something appropriate or something isn't. And I think often it does come down to the certain situation itself. So I think in this particular case, I'm not sure what the specifics are, but I think it is quite different in that a college is often founded on principles of equality and inclusion. So I think if students feel that it goes against the ethos of the college, that creates more complications. But in saying so, it does depend on either situation. But in general, I think cancel culture, when it comes to social media and kind of current discourse, in those situations, it has often gone too far in terms of the movements it generates.
Thank you for that, Natasha. And I have another question to the opposition. Even after social media has moved on from cancelling, would you accept that the ramifications of the cancelling can extend far beyond this time period for the individual targeted? Which one of you, Excel?
I struggle to understand the concept of the question. If the idea is that in the future, when we don't cancel anymore, it can still have ramifications for the person, of course, any type of online, anything can have an effect on anyone. Any type of online harassment can have an effect on someone. But my argument is that online harassment is one thing that has existed for as long as people have been able to interact with each other online, and cancel culture is a different process wherein people have been able to speak out, ostracize, or not patronize a certain person or group. So if the problem is online harassment can have far-reaching consequences for people, of course, this has been happening since AOL was a thing in 1992. I'm sure there are people who are still very much hurt and offended by like message boards. That's not endemic to cancel culture though, so.
And there is another question to the opposition. Sorry, that it seems a bit one-sided. If possible, if the audience could provide some more questions from the proposition, that would be great. Here's one. By framing this in terms of celebrities, are we not erasing the experiences of working class people? The effect of losing your job for a working class person, which could include losing regular source of food or not being able to pay one's rent, is far more different to the effects it would have upon a multimillionaire like J.K. Rowling. This person who's written this question cannot help but feel like the debate as it is currently being framed is ignoring the class conflict, mountains of literature surrounding class conflict, and the differing consequences of both social and economic punishments for working class people versus those for the rich. and for the middle class. How would you respond? Who wants to go for that, Natasha?
I think definitely it is quite true in that cancel culture affects so many people, including the middle class. And I think thinking back to the past where people have, say, tweeted something and then they've been later fired from their job, people from the middle class. I think that is a big reason why cancel culture is such a bad thing for two reasons. Firstly, because in the case of celebrities, it is far easier to jump on board to attack one side, and then everyone kind of gets too involved in it to a certain extent where they don't have that many repercussions. So it seems quite unfair that middle class people are affected to an even more extreme extent, given that they don't have reputation or millions of dollars to fall back on. And I think secondly, with middle class people, for example, when they have made mistakes, such as saying something bad a long time ago on Twitter or expressing hateful views, in the case of cancel culture, it emerges and millions of people take sides, and so many people get involved to an extent where, in comparison, if we didn't have this very toxic cancel culture, potentially the firm or the company could find it and have like a proper discussion with them. And in that case, it seems that that is a much more civil process rather than millions of people online taking sides on this poor person's career. So I think for those two reasons, generally, you do make a fair point. It is not just about celebrities, but I think it affects middle class people even worse, even more so, because they don't have the power to fall back on.
Does the opposition want to respond to that question, which was largely aimed at you guys? Dan?
Well, I think obviously it's a very good point to consider the differences between those millionaire celebrities and someone with a regular job who really depends on that. And first of all, I want to stress that I believe that usually we mainly see the people who are crying out about cancel culture are already relatively well off. So I think they are the majority of cases, or corporations with large reserves. But of course, there can be examples where it will be more problematic. But I think you also have to keep in mind that, say, someone in a workplace harassed one of the co-workers, that could lead to those co-workers simply not wishing to work with that person anymore, not feeling safe to work with a person anymore. And I do believe that there are examples where a similar thing could arise. For example, someone tweeted a whole bunch of racist things online. I can imagine that some of that person's co-workers would feel uncomfortable working with them, or unsafe working with them. So although I believe that I agree that's a more difficult situation here, there are still, I think, clear examples where it is definitely valid. But at the same time, this is just a situation that doesn't arise as much as celebrities are just so much more prominent online with their enormous platforms. So I do believe it's a fairly marginal case.
Oh, Exo.
My response to this is two-pronged. Firstly, as I mentioned before in my first statement, in regards to people losing their jobs from private companies, they do retain the right to do that when you sign your employment contract. And most notably, they do this without cancel culture. All of us here, if we were to try and get a job, we would have a background check carried out against us. If your name is attached to your Twitter profile, your employer can find out everything you've tweeted without anyone calling you out or retweeting it. Once you put your opinions on a public platform, it's essentially giving everyone a megaphone giving yourself a megaphone to everyone's ears. They can hear consistently your opinions. And it timestamps exactly how you felt at that time as well. As my teammate Dan also mentioned, it becomes a workplace issue in many cases. Someone tweeting out something inflammatory or racist, or transphobic or bigoted in any way becomes an issue for the people you have to work alongside. Another thing I should mention is that the idea of working class people being victims of cancel culture because they can lose their job and source of employment also predates what we're calling cancel culture. Most notably, both here and in the US, in the 1920s all the way through to the 1960s, there were labor union blacklists for people who joined unions for their workplace, and it prevented them from achieving employment. In the 80s, this changed from blacklists necessarily to just lists of troublemakers, not really associated with unions. Actually, it was during Thatcher's time, but the idea of your employer not wanting to work with you because of things they find distasteful or abhorrent can be terrible, but this isn't something caused by cancel culture, because if you put something on social media, everyone has access to it. And it's also not something unique to our time, because employers, capitalists, people who own workplaces have always had the ability to limit access to employment based on things they find distasteful. This is everything from labor unions to your tweet that only got 2 likes. It's just how like work is organized presently. I should also add that notably, when the proposition put their points forward, they never brought up anyone who was extremely small, working class, not a public figure, who got criminalized by millions and millions of people attacking them. And this is because of how unlikely it is to happen. If you're a small person on a small platform with a small profile, the likelihood that you would say something so unusual and inflammatory that millions of people would discover it and therefore ruin your life, it's barely there. And I think that's the reason that the proposition didn't bring up any examples of it. The argument is centered around the rich and powerful because they are the ones affected most concretely by cancel culture. And by affected, I mean just receiving criticism from groups of people who've been marginalized for the first time.
Thank you for that, Excel. And we have another question. This is to the proposition and specifically to you, Gabe. It says, if Gabe believes that cancel culture began with the Me Too movement, would he see this as an example of cancel culture going too far or as appropriate? If the latter, when does cancel culture go too far?
I would agree that the Me Too movement was not cancel culture going too far at all. And rather, it was a very empowering process that allowed attention to be brought to the issue. And these groups of individuals to come together and call out the sexual offenders, in this case, and predators, to be able to make a real change. Cancel culture going too far for me is when it becomes rather mindless and people get caught up within their own sides of the argument, which creates a rather divisive nature. And the key thing about cancel culture is that it is transpiring into many different issues rather than these important ones where real change is made and discussed. And we've put forward a few, and the Porter, for example, for one, which again relates to the working class issue, that these issues that used to affect only the rich and celebrities does trickle down and creates an atmosphere where the working class is demonized and most affected by the treatment that should be reserved for those with the resources. So to judge when cancel culture has gone too far is to look at the current climate for almost all issues where people are labeled as being cancelled in the media. To return to a better alternative, again, is to go back to call out culture, to be able to bring attention to an issue and say, this needs to be addressed. We need to look more into this and see what appropriate outcome we can gain rather than just mindlessly calling them out.
Just to reinforce some more questions for the proposition, why does the proposition support allowing bosses just to fire workers? That's incredibly pro-capitalist take, which you may agree with, but seems to once again shift power against the working class. Does either of you two want to respond to that? Or I feel like, Gabe, you probably have responded to that. I'll leave that one. Another question to the opposition, though. As you posited, you believe that cancel culture does not exist. However, I think they mean proposition, I think. However, numerous media outlets have picked up and reported about this cancel culture. My question is thus, do you believe these media outlets are misguided in their interpretation of the current social media environment in judging the existence of the cancel culture? Who wants to take that? Excel?
I should clarify that when we say cancel culture doesn't exist, we mean this perception of there being a solid enough, you know, movement against the extremely powerful. Most of the time, as the proposition agrees with, canceling is largely ineffective. Just last year, R. Kelly was playing to sold out clubs. Practically every comedian who said they've been canceled was back on tour. Bill Cosby has like millions of followers on Twitter. What we mean when we discuss cancel culture not existing is that the consequences that are quote unquote going too far really don't exist. And when the consequences of cancel culture are described, they are not issues endemic to cancel culture, but just issues endemic to how we've organized human society. Everything from people not being able to access jobs because of things they said on social media, to online harassment and bullying have existed without, and before cancel culture. So when media outlets talk about cancel culture, there's simply one reason for this. It generates views. It generates clicks. Cancel culture is part, as I said before, cancel culture is part of capitalism, and so are media outlets talking about them. If a magazine or an online tabloid decides to say Jennifer Lawrence is cancelled, and in the next article they say Jennifer Lawrence has hit the Time 100 list for the 5th time in a row since 2014 or 2015, what does this suggest to you apart from there is no actual consequence towards cancel culture, and it's something made up by the powerful and upholded by the media to basically erase criticism?
And if I could just add to that a bit, as I've pointed out in my speech, it's exactly because most of the people that have been quote unquote cancelled have such an enormous platform to complain about being cancelled that it's been picked up so widely by media and started to be seen as a serious problem. So I think, yeah, it's exactly because of the platform of those people that it's started to be perceived as a problem, even though it really isn't. So I definitely do believe that those media outlets have been misguided in their interpretation of what's going on online.
Gabe, yes.
In regards to this, the impacts of cancel culture, being cancelled is not simply being removed from the public eye. As we defined it at the start, it's being shamed and deprived of business, time, or attention, and having your mental well-being impacted and your brand diminished. It's so much more complicated than this. When you're accused of something or cancelled, even for just a short period of time, this can have long-term effects on your career and reputation. And this is made even more clear when something that you've said perhaps is taken out of context by the cancel culture that's being created, the rapid online Twitter court that we see today. Having these effects means that it has gone too far, that we are not judging people for their viewpoints necessarily, but rather based on this toxic atmosphere. So it's wrong to just say that being cancelled is being removed. Instead, we need to look at the effect on the individual. Even if they are rich and famous, we still need to look at how it impacts.
This is a question, I think, to maybe all of you, or well, at least one of you out of the panel. Someone has asked, could one of you give a clear distinction between call-out culture and cancel culture? I think that's, and how are they different in terms of effects? Who would like to take that one on? Natasha?
I think there definitely are kind of similar concepts, but I think as Gabe mentioned in his speech, cancel culture is a far more extreme step after call-out culture. So I think Jamila Jamil has a really good definition of it, but she's a very strong advocate for call-out culture. Obviously, the lines get blurred, but ideally, what happens is call-out culture is that people are being publicly at least called out in terms of being told why they are wrong, and like action in terms of say underlying just whatnot. I think the issue with cancel culture and how it has evolved, the nebulous I guess nebulous steps where it's kind of like you did some, firstly you made a very public forum, and then thirdly, you kind of get cancelled. Cancelled is a very strong one because, like, psychologically, the moment you hear someone is cancelled, you assume they've done something wrong. Every time you see their name again, done. So I think the word cancelled is a very blanket term where once you've been attached to this word cancelled, it is very difficult to get rid of it. And so on our side, we think that that is very much a destructive concept because it shuts down and doesn't allow any discourse. So I would say that is the difference between a more constructive preliminary step.
Thank you, Natasha. And I think there is a few final questions. I will sort of try and wrap up by past, or we'll have the vote at past. One to the opposition again. Just because the rich man gets to keep doing his thing doesn't mean cancel culture doesn't exist in a very real way for the working class who are fired from their jobs by woke bosses attempting to make a profit and are quite happy to screw over workers in the process. The ones you've heard of may have been famous, but that doesn't mean that it's anywhere near the majority. You've heard of them precisely because they are rich. Who would like to take that? Dan or Excel? Excel?
Again, as this person described, the woke rich man getting to keep his profits by firing a poor person because of some statements they made is endemic to capitalism, not cancel culture. This is a problem with a boss having power enough over the employer to ostracize them from employment. This is not a problem with cancel culture, as I've highlighted. People were doing this since the 1920s to members of labor unions. Would we call this cancel culture? Because according to Gabe, it started in 2012. Is this cancel culture as well? And as I said again before, even if you don't find out about someone being canceled, anything you put public, any information you put public about yourself is vulnerable to scrutiny by your employer. That's what happens when you sign an employment contract. You hand over your rights to be fired. When you apply for a job, you surrender your ability to be background checked. And if your boss has a background check and you come up wanting, you're not good enough, or you say something that makes the company uncomfortable, or the boss is woke and ignorant and just wants to secure the bag and doesn't care about whether you have food on the table, that's not cancel culture's fault. You've put a public opinion forward. Regardless of if it gets 1 retweet or 1 million, people can still see it. And that's not a problem with cancel culture. That's just how social media operates. So.
Does any of the other panelists want to make a final contribution before we finish this? Yes, Gabe.
So in regards to the whole capitalism, I don't think it's fair just to say we live in a capitalist society, therefore we just need to let this cancel culture carry on happening. Rather, we need to ask why these companies feel the need to distance themselves so much from these individual workers, and why there is that pressure on them, why the atmosphere that they can't have any employees be associated with the companies who may challenge traditional conventions. For example, an Asda till worker being fired for sharing a religious sketch on his private Facebook page shows that everyone is vulnerable to this. Instead, we need to create an atmosphere where companies do not feel the pressure to immediately dissociate themselves from these people, but rather create a positive and discussive atmosphere where everyone has the right to maintain their job, maintain their source of income, and challenge different.
Brilliant. Thank you, Gabe, and thank you, Excel, for your final contributions. We will now go to a vote before we sort of finish proceedings. So all those in favour of the motion, this House believes cancel culture has gone too far, please can you react with a thumbs up now, please. Okay. And all those not in favour of the motion, please raise your hands now. Do a thumbs up. And those abstaining still. Okay. Well, I can inform everyone that that was a rough change, at least. We saw an increase for those in favour of the motion by 5, and we also saw an increase for the no vote as well, though, by 2. Nevertheless, the motion was passed by 12, and it was objected by 8, and 2 abstentions continued. Okay, that is the end of the debate tonight. Just to inform you, in 2 weeks' time, we will be doing the debate. This House believes the role of prisons should be rehabilitation. We look forward to seeing you then. Thank you, everyone, and good night.